about our speaker today, Dana Frank. She teaches now at UCSC in the history department. She just wrote a book called Local Girl Makes History, thank you, and which is about the South Bay, this very area, and some of the icons in the area, famous spots and destinations here. She grew up in the area. She just told me that she used to ride her bike up and down Saratoga, Sunnyvale here before the college was even here, I think. So she'll be talking about researching and writing and some of the considerations of that. So I'll let her speak at the podium and tell you what she wants. So this is Dana Frank.
Thanks. We have till?
You have till 1:45. So.
Okay, till 1:45. Okay, hi, now you clap? Okay. You're so polite. Everybody's so polite. Well, thank you so much, Doug, and thanks all of you for coming. I know it's again, some of you had to come, but and thanks to teachers that didn't have to come. And my sister went to Foothill Community College, and my closest friend teaches English 1A, and the one before that, and the one after that, sometimes at De Anza and Mission College and Cabrillo College. So I hear a lot about 1A students. So I know I get to see what the English comp students look like at the community colleges over here, so it's really fun to see you all. And I sort of wish that I had taught community college instead of at the UC level, so I'm really happy to be here. And I want to thank Doug for inviting me here, and it's really fun. So I don't know if people want to sit down, and if you want to ask questions along the way, it's fine. And if I talk too fast, just go like this, and I'll slow down, okay? But there's no quiz. Fine, you don't have to get the names and the dates like if you were in my class. And I hope some of you will transfer to UC Santa Cruz and take my labor history classes and come and tell me that how you first knew me. So what I'm going to talk about today is this stuff, part of this book. And it's like he said, it's called Local Girl Makes History. And the subtitle is Exploring Northern California's Kitsch Monuments. And mostly I'm going to talk about the researching that I did for this book, but I'll talk about the book in general because that's how I can explain the research that I did, especially since in the case, I'll talk about this, in the case of this book, the research and the writing were all mixed in together and they were part of the same process, so I'm going to talk about that. And you know, as you can see from the title of the book, it's partly a joke. Local Girl Makes History, like I'm famous. And even though I'm not, and mildly, and also Local Girl Makes History. I grew up in Mountain View and still live around here, and so it's also about history in terms of I'm a local girl, but it's also about the process of me as a local girl drops watch. So the franchise is open if you want to write Local Boy Writes History or Local Girl Teaches English. You can do something with the title. I don't feel like I have a copyright on the title. So let me just tell you about this book. I wrote some pretty standard history books so that I could get my job and get tenure and get raises. And I started experimenting with books that were about, and my main field is U.S. labor and working class history. And and women's history. And I started writing books that tested the limits of how much I could write for a popular audience, not just captive students in a class or other professors, and most professors write for other professors at the UC level. And that's sort of the system. And I started wanting to write in more and more popular genres for regular folks. And I did that, but I was still sort of within the boundaries of traditional academic writing, more or less. And meanwhile, I started writing this thing in my head. Now, most of you already know that if you're, the whole cult about writing is that if you're going to be a writer, well, first of all, if you're a writer with a capital W, you write fiction, okay? And you're one of these people, if you're going to be a writer when you grow up, that somehow you started writing short stories in the 2nd grade, you edited the neighborhood newspaper in the 7th grade, by the time you were in, 8th grade, you were having stories rejected by magazines, and you published your first novel at 21, okay? We all know that story. I didn't do any of those things. Though if you know who Stephen King is, there's a great interview with him in the New Yorker, and also he has a book about writing that's really a great read, a really easy read if anybody ever read that book. And he has a great story about, it sounds just like what I just said, and how hard he worked, for how many years he got rejections from those stories from mystery magazines. So, but I'm not Stephen King, okay, or you would have heard of me. But I did start writing these little stories after I came back, and I grew up and I went to what used to be called Awalt High School in Mountain View. It's now Mountain View High. And I went to UC Santa Cruz to college, and then I went back east to graduate school and lived back east for 10 years. And when I came back and I got my job in Santa Cruz in 1991, I started writing these little things in my head about places that I had gone to as a kid, and what if I did a little riff about these places from my childhood and how I understood them now. And the first one that I just started imagining was, how many of you ever been to Big Basin Redwood State Park or Henry Cowell State Park? Okay, well, there's one of these at Muir Woods. They're all over the place. And if you've seen the movie Vertigo, how many of you have seen the movie Vertigo? If you haven't seen it, go watch Vertigo. You don't even have to leave your house. And you just can get it on Netflix. There's these logs, the slice of an ancient redwood tree. They're always 2,000 years old. And they have rings for every year that the tree put on it and markers on the tree to show the march of time. And it's always Jesus Christ at the center, and then they have Julius Caesar and the Roman Empire, and then they have Christopher Columbus, and there's always this standard tale, and the tale is always centered in Europe, and it always moves outward and celebrates all these invasions and conquests, okay? And that's always a story, that there's always this sort of a story of imperial Eurocentric contrast projected onto these trees. So I decided to write this thing in my head about coming back and, what did I see in that tree and why were all those dates on that tree? And I started writing this little introduction in my head. Lots of writers, you probably do this too. Before you write an introduction, you kind of get a little thing going in your head, a little phrase, before you ever write a word. And I had this whole little 3-page introduction in my head that I carried around for about 7 years. And then I said, Dana, you're either going to do this or you're not. And meanwhile, I started writing this other one. And if you've been to the boardwalk in Santa Cruz, how many of you have been on the boardwalk? Okay, now how many of you have been on the cave train ride? Okay, how many anybody been on the old cave train ride before they redesigned it? Okay, it used to be this really weird thing, right? And it was this and there's a picture of it actually on the cover, the old one. And it was this Flintstone ripoff that was getting kind of seedy. And it has this cult following in Santa Cruz. And it had this famous scene when this cave woman had was wearing a toga, of course, and she had a club, and she had knocked out this cave guy, and he was unconscious, and she was wheeling him into a wedding chapel, unconscious. Okay, classic cave people, clubs and togas humor. We're used to it. The Geico ads are the latest version of that. And I'm like, what is this, totally sexist thing doing in Santa Cruz? It's feminist town and full of artists. And so it turns out there's a cult following of that cave train thing. So I wrote this whole thing. So I started writing this thing about the race and gender politics of cave people and what were they doing, these cave people doing underground in Santa Cruz. And we all take for granted we know who cave people are and that they wear togas and have clubs, neither of which were true. But so I started writing that one in my head and finally said, I'm just going to write this book and I'm going to explore these places and write about their history and tell the story of me investigating it and do a little riff on each of these places. And the one on the redwood tree is called Redwood Empires, and it turns out there's all this imperialism projected onto redwood preservation. Why is the Northwest Coast called the Redwood Empire, for example? You can go up there and watch Vertigo, and you'll see the dates that Kim Novak is going into a trance, and she points to the dates on the tree and says, here I lived, here I died. That's it for my Kim Novak channeling this character in this famous Hitchcock movie. No more movie star imitations. In this book, I just was really having fun. And I sort of developed this genre that's part me, professional historian, going back and investigating the history of each of these places. And it's part just telling the story of how I researched it and what I found along the way, no matter how silly or surprising it was. And some of it is an analysis of this thing and its politics. Who are cave people? What kinds of racial stuff and gender stuff gets projected onto cave people at different points of time? What's the notion of time that was on redwood trees? And there are 2 other chapters, and one of them is a place called, now this is going to be a little harder, but at least they're on this side of the hill. Santa Cruz, it's a little harder. Anybody ever been to the Pocus Water Temple? Pocus Water Temple? Okay, we got one over here. The Pocus Water Temple is, where you go up San Francisco Peninsula on 280, on Highway 280, and there's a reservoir along the left. That's Crystal Springs Reservoir, and that's the city of San Francisco's water supply. And it comes from a piece of Yosemite National Park that the city of San Francisco dammed in the 1920s to get their water supply. National Park, they put up a big dam. It's called Hetch Hetch. That water comes all the way from the Sierra Nevada, all the way across California, under the Coast Range, across San Francisco Bay, under San Francisco Bay, goes through some neighborhoods in Sunnyvale and Mountain View, and it bubbles up in this Grecian temple thingy called the Pocus Water Temple that was put up in 1938. And it used to be when I was in high school that you could go there and it would bubble up in the middle of this thing and then go out a tunnel. And there was a story that went around that there were these guys that would jump into the tunnel and swim out. Okay, and if the water was too high, you would drown, and the water was too low, they'd break their necks. Okay, so I always wanted to know about that story about the guys in the Pocus Water Temple. So I decided to write another chapter about that story, and every time I tried to investigate it, somebody would say, oh, I don't know about the jumpers, but that's the place where they tried to put LSD in the water supply. Or, oh, that's the place where people used to run naked through the ponds. And so that chapter is called I Heard It Through the Pocus Water Temple, and I investigated all these myths about the Pocus Water Temple and the politics of it. And I'm not going to tell you which ones are true. You have to read the book, okay? And you can buy it for $20 if you want. Okay, but I don't care if you buy it, but if you want to have fun. Okay, so the chapter, that's the book in general. And I was developing a genre as a writer, and it was actually kind of tricky because, you know, as writers, there's all this stuff about voice and tone. Okay, so when I wrote the first chapter, which was the one about Big Basin and the redwood tree, I would sort of flip-flop in voice. I would be half the time of the know-it-all professor that had read 50 books and written this and knew all it was know-it-all, and the other half would be like too fake innocent. I didn't realize that until I did this that I would find that blankety blank, right? It was like I couldn't be both people in my voice at the same time, right? I couldn't be the person who had all the background and at the same time the sort of innocent voice of naive discovery. And how many of you had problems with, like, you know, flip-flopping in your voice? Your teachers told you this? This is a basic thing. The rule of voice is choose a voice and stick to it. You have to be consistent all the way through, and I knew that. But it took me a while to figure out how to do it in this book. So I'm not going to, sometimes I read from it, but I'm actually going to just talk about the research for the fourth chapter, which is the longest chapter, and it's twice as long as about all the other chapters. And it's called Upstairs, Downstairs at the Cats. Okay, probably most of you know this one. You know the two stone cats in Los Gatos by Highway 17? How many of you know about that one? Okay, so if you haven't, and don't try to pull off in your car. From Los Gatos, it's actually a little easier, but it's getting back onto 17. That's the hard part. So, you know where, like, the Los Gatos exit pops right onto 17, the last exit, there are these two stone cats. If you look back to the right, there are two stone cats, and here's a picture of me at the stone cats in 1963. I'll pass it around. Little kid, and the answer to your math question when you see it is 52, which is how old am I now, if you see the picture. And those cats are the icon, you know, in downtown Los Gatos. They have them on the banners, and they're sort of the symbol now of Los Gatos. Okay, so I always wondered about those cats, and especially since I was a U.S. historian, I wondered who put them up. And I thought, gee, it wouldn't be fun to write about that someday. Okay, so this is the first research story. When I was in graduate school, I was working on one of my professors hired me because I was back east, and this archive was the Hoover Institution Archives, which is at Stanford University. And there was this feminist peace activist, suffragist named Alice Park, who had lived in Palo Alto in the 19-teens and 20s. And her personal papers, so all the records that she kept in her life, all her diaries and her letters and all this stuff, and letters that she'd received her whole life, are all at the Stanford University Archives, at the Hoover Institution Archives. So my professor hired me, back in the story, to do some, since it's Women's History Month, I'll say a little more. She was interested in the concept, the word feminism, and when it first came into use in the United States. So she asked me to read this woman's diaries and see did she ever use the term feminism in the 1920s. And when I was in that woman's papers, there was a letter, in one file, there was a letter from a woman named Sarah Bardfield. Just a little letter, and at the top, and it was to this woman, Alice Park, at the top, there was a little drawing, a little tiny sketch of a cat that looked just like the ones in Los Gatos, and it said Sarah Barfield, the cats, Los Gatos. So it was her special letterhead, and she lived up there. And this woman, Sarah Bardfield, was a famous suffragist and poet that had once driven across the country all by herself to get votes for women in 1918 or 1917 or something. And so I'm like, oh, well, that's who lived up there. And I mentioned to this some people I knew that you knew U.S. history, and they say, oh, she was married. You got to learn these names. Okay, her name was Sarah Bald. I'll just call her Sarah. And she was married, someone told me. Now, notice how I'm doing my research. Somebody told me that she was married to Charles Erskine Scott Wood. Okay, so we'll just call him Erskine as he went by. Okay, so Erskine, and he was a famous Bohemian poet and anarchist, but also a former corporate lawyer from Portland and a former Indian chaser in the U.S. Army. And if you've heard of Chief Joseph's famous "I will fight no more forever" speech, he transcribed it, and some people think he wrote it. So he's this sort of famous flamboyant anarchist guy that was an ex-corporate lawyer, got a lot rich as a corporate lawyer in Portland, and then wrote things for little literary magazines. And the two of them put up, I learned that the two of them had put up this house above that road in Los Gatos at some point in the early 20th century. That's all I knew. So I put that away. Wouldn't that be fun to write about? Like, you know, you're looking for a little research in your classes, and you just put it in the back of your brain. Okay, so then about 10 years ago, and I was like, I don't know, more than 25 years ago. So like 10 years ago, I'm hired this guy named Robert Balzer to put new linoleum on my bathroom floor. And he's about 65 at the time, and we're just sort of I guess I can say bad words in the tape, you know. We're just shooting the shit and during, you know, while you wait for the goo to dry on the floor. And I say, so where are you from, Robert? He says, Los Gatos. And I say, where? And he says, oh, you know where the cats are? And I said, sure, that's where Sarah Bardfield and C.E.S. Wood lived. And he says, that's where my grandparents lived. I grew up running around that estate, and they were the gardener and chauffeur and cook and maid for those two poets their whole lives. So his Italian immigrant grandparents were the servants, live-in servants to those two poets for their whole lives, the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. Okay, so I'm like, holy smokes, right? And he can't believe I know who those people are, and I can't believe I've just met this guy, and I'm like, okay, there's a story there. Okay? Now notice how I did the research. How would I even know there was a story there, right? You have to sort of realize you see something somewhere else, and you think, well, that would be interesting to do research about. Okay? But also because I'm a labor historian, I'm interested in regular people's work, right? I'm interested in that story there because it's about these two. We always hear about the writers and the bohemian intellectuals like me, but you don't hear the story of the servants and the immigrants that make the poet's work possible. Right? So I was interested not just because there was the story there is what is the relationship between the immigrant servants who spent their life waiting on these people. What's the relationship between there, and how would I research it? Now, I know as a historian that we know a lot about the history of domestic servants, but we know nothing about individual stories of those kinds of dynamics. So I thought, well, there's a great story, okay? And I filed that away for about 10 years. And you can see there's another layer to the story to that layer, because which side am I on? My grandmother was an Italian immigrant that was a seamstress that worked doing alterations for rich ladies at a department store in Beverly Hills. Okay, so my grandmother was on the servant side of that, but now I'm a middle-class person who is hiring the grandson to put in the floor in my kitchen. So which side am I on in this story? There's another story with me in it, another layer in what I want to do. Okay, so that was my project, and that's what I decided to write about. I knew I had this great story, and I had these questions, like what is the master-servant story here? And the other big question I want to stress before we talk about the research is how do you make those four people equal in the eyes of history? Okay, so how do you take the servants and you do the research in a way that the servants are important as the masters or the employers or the famous people, okay? And this is a huge research challenge because we know a whole lot about presidents because every time a president sneezes, to put it politely, we have a record of it. We have every letter they ever wrote, and we have all this stuff, thousands of biographies, and we don't have the same kind of history of ordinary people. But look at all of us. Maybe we got some really famous poets in here in the room, but most of us are regular people. And how do we have a history that validates our lives as much as the lives of the famous people? And how do you actually do the research? Because the research bias is going to be toward the rich people. It's going to be usually toward men rather than women, because men keep historically the roles they've been in produce more public records. And also, so it's going to be about, and also because of U.S. history, that's also going to be about race, because the well-to-do are more likely to be white, and the people at the bottom, but not all, but many of the people at the bottom are more likely to be immigrants and people and working-class white people. And so there's a whole race politics to that as well. So I'm conscious of that, and I don't want my book to come out that way. I want it to be a story of four equal human beings with different structural positions, okay? So first I start, well, how do you even do this? So you imagine, take 2 seconds and imagine how you're going to learn about these 4 people, okay? Just imagine 3 things you're going to do. Or zone out for 2 minutes while I say, imagine 3 things you're going to do. Okay, just imagine that. Okay, so the first thing I did, obviously I made sure I had the phone number of the guy, the linoleum guy, right? You don't want to lose that. I thought I had for a while. Okay, so first I started with C.E.S. Wood, the most famous of them, because there was a whole biography of him. Okay, so this guy, a professor at the University of Oregon, had written a whole biography of C.E.S. Wood, Erskine, the employer guy, and that biography is by a guy named Robert Hamburger, which I just love that name. And by the way, I put the story that the guy's name was Robert into the book, right? So just because it's entertaining. Okay, so he has this whole biography, and everything I just told you, if you guys could not whisper, that would be great. Could you guys not whisper because it throws me off? Thanks. So this is like if you're a teacher and people are whispering in the back, they're actually saying, whoa, she's cool, but you think they're saying, oh boy, this is really crap. And so you sort of, it throws you off in the middle of a talk. Really, you're saying, oh, do you want to have a beer on Friday night? But I'm thinking like, oh, what are they saying? And what maybe I should change what I do. Okay, so this book told me, now this is what is called a secondary source, and this is a basic concept that historians use. A secondary source is something that somebody like me came along and wrote a book using documents and other sources. A primary source is anybody know this concept? A primary source is something like a letter or a document or an interview or newspaper story that was written at the time. So the raw stuff, okay? If we were scientists, we would call it data. But it's the stuff that is produced all the time that we use for historical evidence, okay? A secondary source is somebody like me comes along, reads a whole lot of that stuff, and puts it together in some kind of larger analysis or narrative. And a biography is a secondary source. So I got all this stuff on C.E.S. Wood, and I know all sorts of things about him. I know his story, his life history. So I'm cooking with gas here, okay? I know a lot about him. I also have in there a bibliography. Somebody published a bibliography of everything he ever wrote. So he has like 7 or 8 books. He wrote all these bad poems. He wrote all these essays. And I have somebody did a list or bibliography of everything that he ever wrote. So I could have spent like 2 years just reading that stuff, right? Because he wrote a lot of stuff. And there's a book about some of his writings that I also found. And how did I find that? I went into the computer. I went into the Melville system. Do you have access to Melville here? It's the University of California, M-E-L-V-Y-L. It's the University of California. Everything that's in the University of California Library and also the State Library Archives. And I put in Wood, Charles Erskine Scott Wood, and up popped those 2 things I just told you about. Not very mysterious. And you can do that in 2 seconds in a library, computer, or you can access it other ways. Your teachers can help you with that. Okay, so I got that. Okay, now I also found, but I looked Sarah Bardfield to see if there was anything about her, and all I got, and I also, you can Google these people too and see what you can find. On her, there is no biography, but I found an oral history, that a women's history or a history of women oral history project, somebody interviewed her for 2 weeks in 1964, and it's this thick, this long oral history. Now that's a primary source, but she went through her whole life story in the version that with the questions they wanted to ask her. Mostly they asked her about, did you know so-and-so other famous people? Okay, but at least I had her voice in 1990. These people are long dead. I had her voice telling her life story, so that was a pretty big deal. Okay, and I looked in the index under the 2 servants, Vincent and Mary Marengo. Okay, and in the index to the biography of Wood, there were like several tiny little bits about Vincent. Okay, and you look in the index to the oral history. I was lucky it was indexed, and there's her telling some little stories about Vincent and Mary. Okay, so I've got a lot on the 2 masters, but a little tiny. How do I get Vincent and Mary? There's no biographies on Vincent and Mary Marengo, right? Nobody has anything like that. Okay, plus, if you look in the Wood biography, there's stuff about his wife, right? So Sarah Bardfield shows up in her husband's biography. So you're not going to find it under her name, but if you look in the biography of him, he's going to talk about how they met and who she was, right? So that's a sort of another way you got about her. Okay, so then I look at the now this is a basic rule of research. You get a secondary source and you look at its footnotes. So how did this guy, Robert Hamburger, know what he knew? I love saying that, Robert Hamburger. How did he know what he knew about C.E.S. Wood, right? And he he used the archives at the Huntington Library in Pasadena. Okay, anybody ever been to the Huntington Library? It's this very, what?
San Marino.
San Marino. It's this,
The rich of the rich.
the richest of the rich places in Southern California. And it was this guy's real estate magnate's mansion. And it has all these statues of nude Italians and fancy vistas. I'm not kidding. Japanese gardens. Beautiful, the most beautiful gardens. The whole most beautiful garden in the country. It's gorgeous. And it has this, this guy's getting going here. And it has this research library that is the snootiest place I've ever been in my life, okay? And we're talking snootier than Yale, where I went to grad school, okay? And the whole thing is designed to look sort of Cambridge. And it's like, okay, here's the carols for the office. They give you the tour. They say, these are the offices for the people that are here for the whole year. These are the rooms for the people that are here for 6 months. This is the reading room for the people that are here for 3 months. This is the reading room for documents for the people that are here for 2 weeks. And this little table here is for people like you that just came today, okay? And I have to have a name tag, and I have to have references. And I've like published 3 books. They want references, okay? And I have a lot of attitude by this point on the tour, I'll tell you. But also, the Huntington Library replicates everything I'm writing about. And which side am I on, okay? Because this is elite rich people's house from the similar period of the people I'm writing about, and it has 200 Latino security and African-American security guards working there. It has all these people waiting on me. I get a subsidized lunch, but the people that work there don't get the subsidized lunch. Which side am I on? Because I'm going like, eek, this is so snooty, but I am not the security. So I even told the story of how the Huntington research itself replicated what I was researching, okay? So in there are 300, you call it, this is how to do archives, and archives are a little daunting, and the archivists are always a little snooty, and they get a little territorial about these documents they have. In the Huntington Research Library, there are 300 boxes of the papers of Charles Erskine Scott Wood and Sarah Bardfield. Now, they were obsessed with their own historical self-importance, so they kept every letter they ever received in their whole life. They kept a diary of what they did every day. They kept clippings of everything they ever wrote, and monster piles of photographs. And all that stuff is in 300 boxes in Pasadena. Okay, so I got the guide to the 300 boxes. How am I going to find Vincent and Mary? I could spend the rest of my life just reading those 300 boxes, right? I'm not going to do that, needless to say. I got a week, right? Well, I got a week, okay? And so what I do, I look under Marengo in the list of correspondence of the people that wrote in. I look under Marengo, which is Vincent and Mary Marengo's last name, the servant's last name. And in there's 2 postcards from Mary after she moved off the estate when she was old, and 1 letter from Vincent. Okay, that's all I have. Okay, so I got a little bit, but I'm not getting anywhere. So then it turns out there are diaries, okay? So I get the diaries, and the diaries come in a fancy box, and I have to wear gloves, and there's their actual diaries that the poets wrote every day up on the hill in Los Gatos about. And they talk about Vincent and Mary and what they told Vincent and Mary to do and what Vincent and Mary said back to them. And it's full of Vincent and Mary because they're interacting with their servants all day, okay? And so I've got all these stories about Vincent and Mary, and I can see what Vincent and Mary, part of what the masters chose to write about what Vincent and Mary did every day, okay? But it's, okay, so they'll say, we had Vincent putting up the grapevines, or Vincent made the wine, squeezed the grapes for the wine today. Or Mary made up the beds and we cleaned the medicine cabinet. When she says we cleaned the medicine cabinet, she says she told Mary what to throw out and Mary cleaned it, right? So it's not like we cleaned the medicine cabinet, okay? And it's always from their point of view. For example, when they write how Vincent talks, they write it down in classic African-American invented dialect, okay? That white people have invented what's called darky speak, with this sort of imaginary black dialect that supposedly rural black people talk in U.S. history. It's completely invented. And they actually transcribe Vincent's Italian immigrant speech as darky dialogue, okay? And you can see it's in my book. Now you look at Vincent's actual 1 letter, and you can see he's a terrible speller, but it sounds Italian. It doesn't imagine Southern black, okay? So there's just a point of view thing about how do you even know how Vincent talked and what did he sound like, because you're getting it from the master's point of view. Okay, I also wanted to know about those 2 stone cats, because that's kind of my hook on the chapter. So I found listed in the thing a box that said cats. sculptures. And there were all these letters from a guy named Robert Payne, who was the sculptor that made those two-stone cats. And I got his story, and I won't go into that, but I got the story of him back and forth about designing the cats. If I go like this, it doesn't mean you were bad. It means I just got back from Central America, and it just means stressing something. I found all these photographs of the two poets, by very expensive famous photographers like Ansel Adams. But like I said, it's all from their point of view. Even if it's about Vincent and Mary, it's from their point of view. Okay, so then what did I do? So I only had so much time in those archives. I wasn't finding anything more on Vincent. So someone I knew, now watch the research here, someone I knew said, oh, Cynthia Matthews, who's on the city council of Santa Cruz, is the granddaughter of Sarah Bardfield. So I called her up and she said, oh, I'm the great-granddaughter. You want to talk to my parents? And I interviewed her parents who had gone as kids. Her father, as a kid, had gone to his grandparents to visit, and I interviewed him, and the wife had been up there too, about what they remembered about Vincent and Mary and their relationship to their employers. And then they gave me various little documents, like a wine label. And they also, okay, here we get the gold mine. They had home movies made in 1921 through 1935 up at the Cats, showing all four of those people. Okay, now this is, you never find this, okay? And they had digitized them and they gave me a copy of it, okay? Meanwhile, I had figured out from the footnotes from the biography that there was another film in the Oregon Historical Society. And for $100, I could have a video copy, cassette copy of that film, okay? So I watched those films with the grandkids, and they told me who everybody was. And you could see Vincent making grapes. You could see Mary waiting on them at a meal. One of them was even called Vincent and Mary's Wedding. And you could see various people drink shots of people cutting a cake and parading along a road. And that was from called Vincent and Mary's Wedding. So it's kind of you could see one where Vincent smiles up at Mary, who's brought him a plate of grapes. Now, these are really funky home movies from 1927, so the production qualities are kind of low, okay? But they're totally amazing to see these people live action, right? But they're amazing, but it's also important to say, and you can learn, I can talk more if you want about what you can learn from looking at the films. I want to say a little bit about what you can't learn. Sarah Bardfield, the mistress's daughter, whose camera it was, okay? So you're always seeing what she wants to shoot, okay? So it's always nonetheless her point of view. You never see Vincent and Mary when they go home. You never see them inside their house. You never see them with their children and their grandchildren. You only see them in their role with their employers. Okay, got it? And literally sometimes, even the one about Vincent and Mary's wedding never shows the wedding. It only has various really quick shots where you always get the feet instead of the faces, you know, because the camera's painted in the wrong way. I mean, these are big cameras on tripods. It's not like a little handheld thing. And then there's like all these shots of these people wandering around in the woods with plants. And it turns out to be the filmmaker's husband and kids gathering boughs to decorate the car with, okay? She's more interested in her own kids, naturally, than she is in Vincent and Mary's wedding, even though it's called Vincent and Mary's Wedding. So it's just an example of what her point of view was on the wedding. And I'm trying to get what Vincent and Mary's point of view was on this wedding, okay? Okay, so then what I do is I've sort of played out everything I can get from the poet's point of view. And the film from the Oregon Historical Society is really a hoot because it has the poet guy, you know, he's made these antlers out of grapevines, and he's making Vincent and his cousin Dominic wear weird antler grapevines, and there he is with his shirt off, and the guy's about 75 at the time, stomping grapes in a barrel, jiggling with his chest jiggling, and you can see Vincent's going like this, you know. There's all kinds of interesting things in those films about what he was making. You know, it's like, how many of you ever had to wear a silly hat in a job? You know, like, you know, I was with those people that have to work at the Capitola Mall. There's like this lemonade and hot dog place. Anybody ever have to wear one of those outfits? Okay, so you know what I mean about your boss making you wear a silly hat. This was not the hat that Vincent chose to wear. So I'm trying to piece this story together. Now you're thinking about all the really hideous outfits. Did you have a hideous outfit, you in the back row? Nobody ever made you wear that outfit? Okay, well, I didn't either. Okay, so there's what you can learn from the films. But notice how I'm still on the employer's point of view side. okay? So then what I did was I said, okay, how can I learn it completely from the other side? So then I dug Robert Balzer, the linoleum guy's phone number, out of my filing cabinet and called him up. And I was afraid he's going to be dead. He's not going to talk to me. I mean, you know, it's been 10 years since he put the floor in. And he says, you should talk to my sister May. She's the one. And he's a character, okay? And if you read the book, you'll see what a hoot he is, because I actually interviewed him and taped it, and you can get him actually talking, and he's a hoot, okay? And I've already got a character in here, right? And so he gives me his phone number, and also I hire him to put linoleum in my kitchen floor because it has big holes in it. And I wasn't sure I could get him to do an interview with me, but if he was putting in my floor, I knew I could get him to talk. And also, I could further in the book, end the book with, here he is putting in my kitchen floor at the end of the book with that which side am I on story, right? So I'm setting up some of the writing stuff. I'll come back to that. Okay, so then I go to Campbell, and I talk to his sister. I call him cold on the phone. You can do this. You can say, hi, I'm a West Valley student. I'm interested in interviewing you for a paper on this. And, they're much more scared than you are. They're like, oh, my God, somebody wants to interview me, right? And I walk in, and she gives me cookies, and she takes me to the back. And she's in her 70s. Her name's Betty Ann Walzer. And she sits me down, and the first thing that comes out of her mouth before I ask the question is, that woman worked my grandmother to death. Okay, I'm like, whoa, we are on the other side, because that was not diaries, right? The diaries are all about, dear, sweet, loyal Mary, dear, sweet Vincent, our dear Vincent. It's a little different from, that woman worked my grandmother to death. And Betty was plenty sweet. She still is. Okay, so I'm clearly got a different point of view here. And she told me she had worked up there with her, helping her mother out at special occasions, big parties. She said they never saw their grandmother on holidays because her grandmother always never saw the grandkids because they worked 12 hours a day, 6 or 7 days a week. And she had all these incredible stories about what it was like from her grandmother Mary's point of view. Plus, I got Mary's story about how she came from Italy, and she had been married to a guy named Pasquale Gagliasso, who had beat her, and she left him and eventually lived with Vincent and then buried Vincent. So Vincent was not actually the grandfather, was the step-grandfather. And this is a really interesting story. So in the diary, there's this sentence. Okay, now this is before Vincent and Mary have gotten married. And the poet has this in his diary. And he says, Vincent comes to me, Vincent the servant, and tells me this incredible story about the Italian colony of Los Gatos. Now there are about 300 people, Italian immigrants from Los Gatos in 1920. I'll come back to how I know that. And he says, since Mary, the grandmother, left her husband because he'd been beating her and ran away from him. Okay, now this is a Catholic community, very conservative, where this story, I'm seeing it in the diary, 1923. Since Mary left her husband, 12 other women in the Italian colony of Los Gatos have left their husbands. I'm like, whoa! Now there's a story. What was going on with those? These were arranged marriages. A lot of these, Mary's first marriage had been arranged in Italy, like my grandmother's first marriage. What was going on that those women, and then she gets together with Vincent and they have this loving relation for the rest of their lives. And so there's this whole story there that I never learned a word more about those 12 Italian ladies. How would you research that little piece of the history of Los Gatos? I tell Betty this story. She says, whoa, I wait till I get on the phone to try to, she knew who all the ladies were, right? And and nobody ever told anybody that anybody was ever divorced. Okay, that was just completely erased from the history of the Italian-American community in Los Gatos. Okay, so I'm not going to go into all the interviews because I'll run out of time here eventually, but I interviewed Vincent, and he told stories about, not Vincent, I interviewed Robert, the grandson. He told stories about how after Vincent moved into town, they eventually moved into town because Vincent had really bad asthma, and he was like a card shark, and there was some card and billiards room place in downtown Los Gatos on University Avenue, and he used to play cards, but also he was alone, kind of did a lot of lending money to people on the side, and people would come in to pay off their loans, and he was like this card shark operator guy, right? Now, you don't get that from the diaries. You get Dear Loyal Vincent, right? who wants, and so there was this whole story of Vincent. And then Betty tells me the story about, oh yeah, my grandmother was really quiet, but when she was with her friends, yucking it up in the kitchen, she was loud and jolly. So there was a whole nother personality of Mary that came out. And then I won't go into all of it, I interviewed another granddaughter. Eventually, though, the stories start getting kind of vague. One point I had two granddaughters arguing over, Mary was really quiet. No, Mary wasn't quiet at all. How do you even know that? And in the room is a great-granddaughter, and she doesn't even know who Mary is, right? And you realize that oral history, not only is oral history famously fudgy, because you remember what you want to remember, you remember what you think the interviewer wants to hear. There's a lot been written about oral history and how you can't rely on it. Not that everything is the truth either, but we're talking about different pieces of evidence to put together in a story. But they also had a lot of photographs, and they were all in albums and stuff, so I had somebody take pictures of them with a digital camera, and then I came back and I looked at the pictures, and the ones that are in the book, most of them come from the family pictures. So notice this is an official archive. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about in the research is how else could I learn about Vincent and Mary? I don't have biographies, and this is where, being a labor and working class historian, we have these tools that people developed starting in the 60s and 70s about how do you have ordinary people's history. How do I take all of you in this room and make your family histories matter? And there's a series of techniques that are it's what's called social history, which is just sort of like, how do you look at daily life and work and homes and families and regular people? So sometimes this is called history from the bottom up. So first of all, looking for articles, I started in the library again. And I tried articles under Italians, immigrants in California. And they gave me aggregate statistics, and that they mostly worked in agriculture, and here's the regions of Italy they came from, which I'd already figured out that's where Vincent and Mary came from. So I could see the history of people like them, but not anything to understand them, but not anything about Vincent and Mary themselves. So then I tried being new model things. Notice how I haven't gone onto the computer a whole lot here. I tried Google under Italians-Los Gatos. And I got people telling their stories about the Italian restaurants in Los Gatos and their trips to Italy. So I didn't get very far. Or I got the Italian American Heritage Society of Santa Clara County telling me about what I call the celebrity entrepreneur's version of local history, which is the person who, or Los Gatos history, the person who invented gopher traps, the person who had the most famous winery. Anybody who was a business person, entrepreneur, even if they came from that ethnic group, then they get to be famous, but not the people who cleaned houses and worked as gardeners their whole lives. Okay, so then I had two secret weapons. Okay, this is the cool part. There's something called the manuscript census. Okay, you all know what the census is, right? Now it happens in the mail, but it used to be a man or a woman would come down around and they'd come to your door and they'd say, okay, Mel, what's your name? How many people live in this household? And of course, the census is famously inaccurate. Why is it inaccurate now? Well, if I'm an immigration authorities and Mel doesn't have papers, Mel isn't going to say, hi, I'm undocumented, right? This is not exactly going to happen, right? Or Mel, Davey just doesn't like the police for lots of good reasons we can guess, knowing Mel. And so he might choose to not tell, but nonetheless, let's just say, we don't know about Mel's story, but your story is, you trust the census taker. So you say, and the census taker, there's a whole lot more now, but from 1920, you can see the age. And you can get this in the San Jose, you can get an interlibrary loan, you can get it in San Jose, the San Jose City Library, that's also the San Jose State Library, and I think they have this at Los Gatos Public Library now. You can get it on microfilm, and you can see the page that will show the street that you live on if it was around, okay? And it'll say, and you look and it'll say the name, where they were born, what language they speak, whether they're literate or not, whether they own or rent their home, and where their parents were born, and what their occupation is, and what their relationship is to the head of household, okay? So you can look at those, and that's how people reconstruct whole communities. And I looked at those, and it took hours, and the handwriting is often bad, and the copying is often bad. But all of a sudden I found Pasquale Galeasso, Mary's first husband. And I found a bunch of Galeassos in Saratoga, too. And then I found Vincent's mother. I found Vincent and Mary in 1920 and in 1930. And there they were real, right, in 1920, and I could find out things about them. But that only just mostly confirmed things I already know, such as were they citizens or not, did they speak English, where they were born, stuff like that. So, but there's also another thing you can do for this kind of history, and they're called city directories. And before there were phone books, there were these things that were called city directories, and these are all in any public library about the city you're interested in. And they basically list most people in the town or city, and they're this big when you get to, I've used Seattle city directories, the big fat ones, but these ones are little for Los Gatos. And they'll say Marengo V, late Gardner, and where he lives, okay? That's all it gives you, and then, or Mary, wife of Vincent. That's all they give you, but you can find people and where they live. So I could find where their house was, went to town, and I could go see the house. It's on Bachman Street in downtown Los Gatos, okay? This is all in the book, okay? So you don't have to, okay, but I can also see where I can learn other things from these, which I didn't have time to do. But you can go in city directories, they'll give you all the businesses. So you can just look for Italian last names, and you'll see that all the Italians live within 2 blocks of each other, if you plotted that on a map. And you can find the card room that Vincent was doing his little gambling and loan operation thing there. And you can find, and you can see, where all the Italian small businesses were and what they did. You can find the Catholic church that Vincent and Mary went to, and you can start to reconstruct their daily lives in their world in downtown Los Gatos in the 1920s and 30s. So you could do a whole lot more than that. You could also, I have a graduate student that's writing on the history of Mexicans and their relationship to Chinese and Japanese and Filipinos in Fresno in the 1940s and 50s, and she got diocese records of the Catholic Church in Fresno, and it helped that she was Catholic, so they were more open to her using those records, but there's lots of private stuff you can get it. Now, you just want to pass English 1A, right? And you're probably just thinking, oh, I'm never going to do this stuff, but you want to just imagine how you could be, a lot of writing and research is about being empowered to go write the kind of history and imagine the world you want. So let me just end with some general stuff, and then I'll talk about writing. Clearly, there's this unequal politics of history. It took a whole lot more to find out about 1/10 of what I know about Vincent and Mary as what I do about the 2 poets. So I could never know as much about them. And I pretty much exhausted all the sources, whereas I could have spent my whole life reading those 300 boxes and studying those 300 boxes, and also in other people's archives are all the letters that the 2 poets ever wrote. And so it's hard because research is biased, the nature of the public record is biased toward more elite, okay? And that's why women's historians or African American historians, we have a hard time because we have to work harder because most presidents, most famous writers were not women and people of color, so it takes more work to find that kind of history and to make it equal. So the lesson here is partly don't just take the easy route, and then sometimes you have to read things backwards. Like the poet guy will say, well, Vincent was laughing at me while I did such and such thing. Well, you have to kind of wonder, like, what was Vincent laughing at? You at least know that Vincent had a different opinion, right, than what his boss was saying. The other thing is to have fun along the way. And when I wrote the book, I told the story kind of the way I just told you the story. So when something funny would happen, I would just put it in the book. When somebody say something hilarious in an interview, I just put it in the book. And that's sort of, and the other thing about research is follow up leads, like your floor guy, his father. A lot of the book I wrote, not just this chapter, because somebody would say, well, what are you working on? And I'd say, well, I'm working on the Pocus water temple, and they'd look at me weird. But they'd say, oh, my cousin knows someone that jumped in there. Okay, I'm like, okay, write that down. Okay, and it just happens in daily life, and then you get the phone number of the cousin. You have to be willing to call the cousin. But the way I wrote my book, now I'm going to switch to writing and then end. The way I wrote the book, I organized it around my research stories, okay? And I used the first person. So I have me going to these places as a kid. I talk about that picture, and I want that book back because that's my first copy I ever had. So just that picture of me as a kid, I put that story into the book. I took the stories that I just told you, I put them in the book, and I wove stories in this chapter about my Italian grandmother and my father in the story. And in fact, I tell the story of as I was writing it, my father died, and I wonder, will he disappear too? And so you can see I'm playing off of Local Girl Makes History title, but I also wanted to have it be a great read, and I wanted to write history about ordinary people, and not just this chapter, but these stories are about places that we all see. I wanted people to actually read it, not just buy the book or admire it. And we all know things we're supposed to read and we don't, and I wanted people to actually read it at night before they went to bed or on vacation. So I put a lot of work into making the stories I just told you a good read, and some of this was having mystery and drama, and some of it and having characters, so notice how that story has characters. But I also set up the research process to make it a good read. So in the way I just told you the story, for example, I told you what I learned about the poets. I did all the research about the two poets before I did any research about the two servants, okay? So that when you're reading along, I can say, I could have stopped there and it from the other side. So now you're thinking like, oh, what else is she going to learn about the servant's point of view? Now, I could have done research on both sides all along the way. You know, I could have been interviewing grandkids on both sides, but if I did that, it wouldn't be nonfiction if I told you I did this, I looked at these people, and then I looked at these people. Because there's a lot of people that write so-called memoirs that are supposed to be nonfiction, and they make a lot of it up. Or they just kind of fudge the story, the order of things happen. But I'm a professional historian. I'm not going to do that. If it's nonfiction, it is nonfiction. In fact, I was just talking to Doug, where are you, Doug, about one of these books that some woman claimed that she was half white and half Native American and had 3 adopted African-American brothers and all these things that happened in her neighborhood growing up. And turns out none of it was true, and the publishers never confirmed research anyway. Another famous book, James Fry, A Million Little Pieces, about, anybody seen this book? Completely made most up about being in drug rehab center, and big scandal when it came out that he said it was his autobiography and his memoir. So I'm not going to go down that road. Some journalists will even fudge the language of what people said or make up quotes. And I have all my interviews on tape. I also did them by hand in case the tape recorder didn't work, word for word, and I'm very, very careful about that. But I set up the research process so that I would have the mystery of what does the other side look like. Do you follow that? And you know, I also did things that would be funny or anything that seemed remotely entertaining to me, I stuck in there. And if it got over the top, my editor or my friend said, oh, that's too much, okay? And also, just let me end, and then we have time for questions, is I spent a lot of time thinking about the reader. And I think when you're starting to write, you just want to like make the teacher give you a passing grade, right? And you're writing for the teacher or some abstract, the rules. But what actually the rules about writing are real, so you can communicate with the reader. So the reader can understand clearly what you said. So you're following a set of codes that the reader knows how to read those and understand what you said. And also that you come out across as somebody who's literate and knows what they're talking about. And a lot of the research is about, you can say, you know, I didn't just make this up. I actually went and interviewed the grandkid. I went and read a biography. I went and read their diaries. And look at the evidence from the diaries. In the diary, now I can say to you what I said, that story about how he imagined Vincent, the dark-skinned servant, talking like stereotype ways in which white people have imagined black people talked in the 19th century. But I can say that to you, but that's really different than if you see the evidence there from the diary, and you can see the way he talked about black people that way, and then you can see Vincent's letter in Vincent's somewhat voice talking. Now the films, by the way, are all, there's no talking, they're all, no, it's not sound. Silent, simple words, see? So you want to have evidence, because you might think, well, gee, that's not true. But if I have the evidence and I can marshal that evidence, I can persuade you of something that you might, some of you are thinking, oh, that's not true. But if I can bring evidence from my research in, then I can win you over to a point of view. If you're writing a letter to the editor, for example, you want to practice writing, write letters to the editor. They almost always get published, and then people read them. And it's a great way to, whatever you have an opinion on, send it into the San Jose Mercury or the student paper. You know, it's a great way to practice writing for the real world. But it's about being clear, but it's also about evidence to persuade people. And as professional historians, I can tell you, we don't have this notion that there's the truth and there's bias. A lot of people think, well, it's about truth and bias. We never use that language. We talk about evidence and interpretation and arguments. That this is the evidence we have. Now, I can give you, I just ran through the I have about those 4 people in Los Gatos. But clearly that evidence is not the same thing as the truth. It's just the most I could learn from the available evidence, approximating some version of what happened up there through the point of view of the questions that I, Dana Frank, have given my personal history and my personal politics, right? So I don't have any interest in being biased. I want to know what happened. I'm looking at from the evidence, but I never ever call that truth or bias. It's just, how do you listen to what the evidence is telling you with as open a mind as possible? And really, and then try to use that. What you're doing when you do research is you're marshaling evidence to persuade readers that whatever you think you want to convince them of. That's a certain kind of writing. But also, I'm doing creative writing tricks like, you know, setting up, little did I know what I would find when I went to the archives. You know, that's just a little creative writing, fiction writing type of trick. Okay, so that was the last point I make, is that you have the reader, and you want to think about the relationship between the research process and the kind of stories and knowledge that we have in the world. Because now there's this story about the cats, and all these people are reading the book, and when they think about the cats, they don't just think about the sculptor or the rich people put it up, but they think, you know, there's a story there about the chauffeur and the gardener and the maid, the cook, the immigrant story about the work that made it possible for those people to sit in their study and write poetry all day. And some of us get to do that, and most of the rest of us are doing the stuff in the silly hats that makes that possible, and hopefully not without silly hats. So let me just take some questions. I think we have 10. Yeah.
Just repeat the question.
Okay. I have to repeat it because of the mic thing. Either that, I have to come up real close and hand you the mic. Okay. And I have a rule in my classes: no question is too stupid. So yeah. Yeah, she each had been married before. They each left their spouses for the other one, although they didn't get married until after his wife died. She had three kids from her husband, and he had his wife and him. He had 4 or 5, and then those kids. And she had one son that died in a car accident, and then two that lived. So, why did you ask? Yeah. And of course, what happened to all those kids and grandkids, and what did they think of the story? Yeah. And this is really interesting. I interviewed the grandkids when I did my book signing at Los Gatos Public Library. The grandkids of the servants came, and it was really wonderful. And the great-grandson, and maybe even a great-great-granddaughter came, and that was really thrilling. I really wanted the grandkids on both sides. The grandkids are in their 70s. And 80s. Okay, so when I say grandkids, we're not little kids. Okay, and I wanted the two sides to meet, but unfortunately, the wife of the grandson on the other side, Kirk Smith, who is in his 90s, his wife died the week before the book came out, and I had the big Bookshop Santa Cruz event that they were going to come to, and so I didn't. You know, I sent them a note, and I'm so sorry, but they obviously weren't going to come to the book signing because some of the grandkids on the other side came to that one as well. So, because I really wanted them to meet, you know, yeah. Yeah.
What did they think about the book?
Well, they really into it. Of course, I don't know what Kirk and Pat Smith, the ones who's, now it's tricky because they're descended from him and not her, and they knew that Sarah was snooty, because I talk about being snooty. And they know that. And they know that these people are famous. They're ambivalent about the Wood biography, because I left out the part about how Wood had about 25 mistresses. At least 2 of them killed themselves. And the daughter who came to the book signing in Los Gatos and had stories about, he was like sleeping with the secretary when she was 17. And he had this office with 2 rooms, and in his corporate law office. Now you're interested, right? And in the inside room, he brought the women to have the affairs. And the biography is called 2 Rooms, and they thought he overplayed that. But so now, what was the question? What was the feedback? I don't know, because the wife died, and I haven't talked to him, and I wanted to give him a couple months. The other kid, they love it, you know. But they're also like, I was afraid. Of course, the grandkids, they're like, oh, our grandmother, you know more about our grandmother than we do. So the Vincent Mary Mango's grandkids, they think it's a hoot. They think it's a hoot that they're in the story. And also, they come across really well in the story, because I have you know, Robert channeling the grandfather, the card shark, because he's an operator, and I have their banter back and forth with me. So they all love it. One of the sisters didn't come because her husband, you know, this is what happens with people in their 80s and 90s. Her husband was in the hospital for a long time. So, but they thought it was a hoot. I don't know about the other side of the family. I did do a book signing in Berkeley, and someone called in and left me her phone number, who is another one of the daughters on the other side. And I haven't had time to call her back and see what she thinks of it. But it's, you know, what, of course, this is part of the ethics of this whole thing. You're writing about people's families. I mean, I was terrified I was going to offend somebody, especially on the side that doesn't come across as well in the story. Although I also like those people, you know, and I tell about how gracious the grandkids were. I mean, they themselves, sabbatical for 1 quarter, I'd have 10 weeks off and work on 1 chapter in the summer. And then I would do my day job teaching for 6-9 months, and then I'd have another piece of time off to work on it. Or I'd work on it in the summer or on night on a weekend. So I didn't work on it continuously. I did 1 chapter at a time over about 5 years. In the back with the joke? Yeah.
Where did you grow up?
I grew up in what is now Los Altos. We're just about done here. Oh, he wanted to know, where did I grow up? We got 5 minutes. Oh, repeat the question. The one before was, how long did it take? And the one before that was, what do the people think? Okay, where did I grow up? I grew up in it was unincorporated Mountain View. Here's Grant Road. No, here's, it didn't used to be there. Foothill Expressway and Miramani and Grant Road. And here, Mountain View High School is here. And the new Mountain View High School, the old Mountain View High School, is downtown, and I grew up in that neighborhood. The neighborhood is called Loyola Corners, which is where the old train station used to be. It's a drugstore now, and that's the neighborhood that I grew up in. Then it got incorporated into Los Altos after I went to college, so it's technically Los Altos now, but for me, growing up, Los Altos was much more hoity-toity, well-to-do, and Mountain View was much more working class, and we were in Mountain View. I worked at the Mountain View Public Library, and I identified much more with Mountain View than with Los Altos. So I never know, where am I from? But that's the neighborhood. Yeah, over here.
How many stories did you write about?
4. There's 4 in for the chapters. Yeah, there's 4, and this one's twice as long because the research was so much more complicated. And I didn't put the big, long, complicated story until 3rd in the book because I knew that readers wouldn't settle down to it. So the Redwood Tree one is first, and it's kind of serious and sets the genre. And then the Cave Train Run one is mostly a lot of humor about cave people, and that's second. And then the Pocus Water Temple, which is the other really fun one, is last. And this one was 3rd because it's kind of the serious one. So they're really different lengths, and they're a set, but it's not like a single argument book. But at the end, there's this little story. I take my niece Ramona, who's like my daughter, and I take her to the Pocus Water Temple, and I say at the end that I'm sort of passing the story on to her. It has sort of a closure at the end where I say I like to imagine. I can't tell the story without crying, but at that point I say she's turning 16 next month, and I like to imagine that she too will have her own stories to tell about her imagined California landscape, and starting with the Pocus Water Temple. So there is an arc of the narrative over the book. Yeah. Yeah, what am I working on now? Well, mostly I'm really tired because this is my 5th book, so I'm really into. I say this. If you look at the acknowledgments, I say all the people in my life, and I say I love you all, despite the fact not a one of you believe me when I swear I'm never going to write another book. I don't think I'll write in this genre because I only had so many tricks. If there had been a 5th chapter, I'm not sure I would have had it. You kind of have to, each one sound different while doing things that kind of fit together the same, and that's really hard to do. And so I think I want to write some small stuff, small little stories. If you know who David Sedaris is, he's like a humor writer. I want to write David Sedaris about labor stuff and women's stuff that are funny little stories that have some point, that are personal. That's kind of what I've been going in my head, but it just kind of comes. I have a totally different research project that came from something that I did at the same time. That's my official academic research project, and it's complicated to explain, but during the Cold War, the AFL-CIO, the U.S. labor movement, took hundreds of millions of dollars in U.S. State Department money to intervene in the Latin American labor movement, and in the name of anti-communism. And I'm researching that and interviewing people that supported that and people that were opposed to that in Honduras. And I'm going to try to use my research skills, but also my writing skills. But it's a much more academic and political book than this. This is not a popular book in the same way. But I don't know. I mean, part of the fun of, I get paid to do this, and part of the fun is, who am I going to be? Because I didn't know this would work, you know. This was about inventing myself as a creative writer, and it's worked, and now I'm like, okay, now what I do? But I have to say, writing book, you know how you write a paper and you're in a really bad mood, and it's kind of exhausting, and you have to concentrate, and you know, all that stuff? Well, you know, I'm used to it, but it doesn't completely go away. It's normal, and it's hard to get up in the morning and write, but then sometimes you just have this, you start imagining something in your head, and pretty soon you got something, you know, and it's really, that's the creative you know, it's like Stephen King says this in a New Yorker interview. He says, people say, oh, you have a gift, and he says, no, it's 95% gift and 5% magic. And I would say that. It's 95% hard work, and then there's like all the tricks that you can learn how to do it well, like knowing to use characters. There's the magic, that if you know exactly what you want to write, and you've worked, the biggest thing I would say about writing is work really, really hard on the outline. Because if you have, I have everything outlined, every example I'm going to use, every story I'm going to tell, every fact and date lined up in order before I write a word. And then I can just play with words and get rhythms going. And that's the magic, and that's what you know, it's really fun. But the other stuff is just work. But, you know. Are we done, Doug? One more? One more? One more? Yeah. Oh, that's what she was just asking me about. What am I working on now? So right now I have, I'm running the Center for Labor Studies at UC Santa Cruz. I have all next year off for the first time in my life. And I'm trying to, yeah, you know, so it's like, oh my God, I could die. I could die before I ever had something like this in my life, you know, because you could die before you retire, right? And I'm just trying to figure out who I want to be. And you know, this was, you know, I'm still giving all these talks. This is what I'm doing, is stuff like this and talking to people about it. And I still have to write back to all the people that wrote to me that said, oh, you're my cousin, or I know someone who, you know, I have to do that. So and my friend of mine thinks I should have the franchise. I should write Local Girl Writes More History. I have had the idea of writing something that was all the stories that I heard afterwards. But I don't know. You can write the next one. Doug? Okay, thank you so much. That was fun. You guys are great.